the Treasury has a very specific problem when it comes to investment outside of London, which is it's basically what is a cost benefit analysis. Like you look at a cost, but this is one of the very few podcasts I'm allowed to talk about this stuff, by the way. You guys have made a terrible mistake here. I mean, like, usually everyone, as soon as I say the Treasury, they're like, oh Christ, here it comes.
We're all over that.
We're about the money.
So look, if you have a cost benefit analysis, what are you going to do? If someone talks about building a new road or, broadband resources or rail or whatever, you're going to say, well, okay, so where's the area with the most productivity? Because that's where you're going to get the most benefit by facilitating transport, facilitating communications. If that's your only calculation, what do? You put all the money into London because that's where there's the most existing productivity. For you to say, right, we want to build outside of London, for instance, actually, as we were doing with HS2 until Sunak scrapped the whole thing, you have to have a different calculation, which is not, okay, cost benefit is not the ultimate decider. We want to have an industrial strategy, a national communications strategy, basically a leveling up strategy that says these things matter, these areas matter in their own terms, and our economy will do better overall once we start investing in them. So their problem really was that the Treasury for years, for decades actually, had a very, very narrow view of the basis upon which you would do investment. And it's only recently, they've got a new green book to guide civil servants, it's only recently that they've improved. But even though the Treasury has now improved, the politicians aren't really taking any opportunities that have been given to them.
Yeah, I live up north and I can tell you that nothing's improved in that sense.
Yeah.
Like there is certain investment and you see certain bits, but I come down here and I'll see projects that are going on and I'm thinking, they've basically taken something that was fine and made it a little bit more fine down here and probably spent $1 billion.
Yeah.
Okay, and then how much does the system suffer from a short-term perspective?
Oh God, I mean, it defines what it does. Because what else can you do if you have ministers there for 2 years? There's a point when they did universal credit, which is in sort of the parliament between 2010 and 2015. It was the coalition government. And there's loads of warnings about universal credit. They're basically just like, look, you're a bunch of people that are used to having a regular income each month and you're a rational sort of economic actor. And lots of the people that you're dealing with do not have those advantages. Like they can't afford, for instance, if you say, we're going to wait for another 2 weeks before the payment, those 2 weeks will just destroy them. Everything is hand to mouth at a bit of the time. And they're not great at evaluating their finances. So you're going to mess this up and you need to consult much more widely. And again, just like grailing with probation, all of the warnings came exactly to pass. During that period, Lord Freud said he was in charge of part of it. And he just looked around and he thought like, hang on a minute, I have become the institutional knowledge of this project. Like you were having civil servants that moved through that project about once, every 9 months, go on to something else. The whole thing took, years, took like up to 7 years. So he was basically just looking at like the 8th person that was in charge of the project. And you're just like, no, of course, the whole thing's falling apart because nobody knows anything. There was one person there who had actually been following the whole thing from beginning to end. And that's obviously completely short-termist. You would never have an organization to say that we're encouraging people to leave projects before they're done. Actually, encouraging it to happen rather than tolerating it from happening. And that kind of basis gives you these very short-term outcomes. What is this massive red button doing? Is that just, is it like if I say something wrong or forget
we don't know what you're on about.
I did want
you're doing well.
Okay, that's good.
I did want to hit it for what's an OCB?
OBR.
OBR, there you go.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I was going to hit it for them, but you guys were deep in. What is an OBR?
Office of Budget Responsibility.
Thank you. But you were just deep in it, so I was like, if I hit it, he's going to get scared.
Yeah. So there was a good example of this that I saw on Netflix about American policy and the relationship they have with China, and they had a government that was focused on building a positive relationship with China. They did that over a long period of time. China is about relationships. I mean, the world is about them. But they made a lot of headway. And then a new political party came in and they were like, do you want to talk about the Chinese relationship? And they were like, fuck that. We don't want to talk. We don't want to know anything. So they walked into the room with China. And the thing about China is, because of their setup, they have very consistent leadership, very consistent, they know the room. Whereas these new guys walk in who've not even had a handover and go, what's all this about then? And the Chinese were just like, oh, forget this. We can't be bothered. So that short-termism and almost the fact that they're pitted against each other means that they don't transfer. They're incentivized to not pass information over to the other side because they want them to look bad. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's some truth to that. So like it's least pertinent for us anyway. It's different with the Americans, but in foreign policy, it's because Labour and the Tories, I mean, they like to pretend that they have very different foreign policies, but it's pretty similar, really, like overall. One of them is not going to come along and say, I feel differently about Putin. The Americans don't get that thing because apparently one of the parties has now become pro-Putin. So that's a whole other problem for them to deal with right now. But in Britain, that's not the situation that we're in, thank Christ. When it comes to national projects, I mean, HS2 is that classic example of it, really. Although even in HS2, it's not a good example because that's basically the Tories cancelling a project that they had spent 13 years on themselves. So it's not even the perfect example. What you often get is people swapping the policy out between parties. And that is a problem for democracies in general. That is an issue that it's quite hard to get past. One of your solutions for it is a really good civil service that is just there to try and make sure there's consistency between the parties, especially on infrastructure spending, because you just don't want to start cancelling bridges, halfway through. And the rest of the time, you will see changes. Now, one of the people in the book talks about in teaching. It's basically when, the question was asked, like, what would be the ideal thing? This is a teacher. What would be the ideal thing for you in schools? They're just like, just leave it alone. Like, I'm just begging you for once to just for like 5 years, just leave it alone and just let everything settle.
Stop reforming constantly.
Stop reforming, yeah. Especially because you often the ministers don't really know what they're doing. So they'll come in and they're reforming, not really because they believe it needs to be done, but because they want to make a name for themselves. So they'll be promoted at the next reshuffle. So they want to do it very fast. It means they don't really want to listen to much criticism. They don't want to run any pilot projects. Just get it done. We saw that, with sort of part privatization of the NHS in the early part of the coalition. We see it with project after project after project. And that's where the really, really quite dangerous lack of long-term strategy takes over.
The conversation we had with Ian Dunn is one of my favourite ever episodes of the podcast, so you can watch the full thing right here.